The surgical suite smelled of antiseptic and ambition. Margaret Louise Patterson, 65 years old, lay draped in sterile blue beneath the unforgiving fluorescent lights, her breath shallow behind the oxygen mask. Dr. Chen marked her abdomen with purple surgical markers, lines that promised transformation, youth reclaimed, desire rekindled. In 2 hours, she would emerge tighter, firmer, worthy of the man who made her feel alive again. In 48 hours, she would be dead. And 3 days after they lowered her into the earth at Graceland Cemetery, Raymond Cole, the lover for whom she'd risked everything, would be photographed outside a downtown Chicago hotel, his arm draped around a woman half Margaret's age, laughing into the winter wind as if Margaret Patterson had never existed at all. Margaret Louise Patterson was born on March 17, 1959, in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago's South Side, when Motown was just finding its voice and the civil rights movement was gathering like a storm. She came into this world at Michael Reese Hospital with her mother's high cheekbones and her father's stubborn will, gifts that would carry her through 6 decades of joy and heartbreak, triumph and loss. By 65, Margaret had become the kind of woman who commanded attention without demanding it. She stood 5'7" in her stockings, carried herself with the elegant posture of someone who'd taken dance lessons as a girl, and possessed skin the color of black coffee with just enough cream, skin she'd maintained religiously with oils and prayers and the expensive serums her daughter Candace said were a waste of money. Her hair, which she'd recently dyed a rich auburn to cover the silver, fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She was beautiful in that timeless way that made younger women study her at the grocery store, trying to decode her secrets. But beauty, Margaret had learned, was both a blessing and a curse. Her 2-bedroom brownstone in Hyde Park was tastefully decorated with African art collected from her travels. Trips she'd taken alone after her husband of 32 years, Thomas Patterson, had died suddenly of a heart attack 7 years prior. The walls held photographs, Margaret graduating from Chicago State University in 1981, Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day in 1985, Margaret with her daughter Candace at various milestones. There was notably no photograph of her son, Marcus, though his absence hung in every room like incense. Margaret had worked for 38 years as a social worker for the city, shepherding broken families through systems designed to crush them, advocating for children who had no voice, carrying trauma home in her purse like unpaid receipts. She'd retired 2 years ago with a modest pension and a prescription for anxiety medication she rarely took. Retirement, she discovered, was lonelier than grief. Then came Raymond. Raymond Cole, 58, born June 3, 1966, in Memphis, Tennessee, was everything Thomas hadn't been, spontaneous where Thomas was steady, poetic where Thomas was practical, attentive where Thomas had been distracted. Raymond owned a small jazz club in Bronzeville called the Blue Note Revival, where velvet-voiced singers channeled Billie Holiday and Etta James while couples slow danced to songs about love and loss. He wore expensive cologne, Italian leather shoes, and spoke in a voice like aged whiskey, smooth and intoxicating and dangerous if you consumed too much. Margaret had met Raymond at a fundraiser for the South Side Community Arts Center 9 months ago. He'd approached her during the silent auction, complimenting her dress, a form-fitting emerald number that Candace had called too young for her. "A woman who looks like you," Raymond had said, his eyes traveling her body with unapologetic appreciation, "shouldn't be standing alone." Within 3 weeks, they were lovers. Within 3 months, Margaret was obsessed. Raymond had a way of making her feel desired, chosen, special. A feeling she hadn't experienced since the early years of her marriage, before Thomas became consumed with his construction business, before the routine of marriage had calcified around them like plaque around aging arteries. With Raymond, Margaret felt young again. Sexy. Worthy. But Raymond was younger, and the women at his club were younger still, willowy creatures in their 30s and 40s who didn't need Spanx or strategic lighting. Margaret watched them move around Raymond like satellites orbiting a sun, and felt time pressing against her skin like a predator. Margaret's relationship with her own body had been complicated long before Raymond Cole entered her life. She'd been a dancer in her youth, modern, not ballet, with dreams of moving to New York and joining Alvin Ailey. But her father, Reverend Charles Montgomery, had other plans. Dancing was of the flesh, he proclaimed from his pulpit at Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, where he ruled with Old Testament fire and New Testament manipulation. So Margaret had channeled her artistry into other vessels: social work, motherhood, marriage. She'd carried 2 children, and both pregnancies had left their marks. Stretch marks silvered her stomach like ancient fault lines. Her abdomen, once flat and firm, had softened with age and gravity and 1,000 small surrenders women make to time. Thomas had never complained. Thomas had loved her with the steady, unromantic devotion of a man who believed marriage was duty more than passion. They'd built a good life, a house, savings, college funds for the children. They'd attended barbecues and church socials and fundraisers. They'd made love on Saturday nights with mechanical efficiency, neither adventurous nor disappointing, just sufficient. But sufficient, Margaret learned after Thomas died, was another word for settling. Her relationship with her daughter Candace had grown strained over the past year. Candace Patterson Williams, 38, was a pediatric surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, brilliant, accomplished, and possessed of her father's pragmatism. She'd been skeptical of Raymond from the beginning. "Mama, you barely know this man," Candace had said over Sunday dinner 3 months ago, her voice carrying the edge that came from too many years of medical training and too little sleep. "And the money you're spending on him." "I'm not spending money on him," Margaret had insisted, though she'd co-signed a loan for Raymond's club renovations and bought him a Rolex for his birthday. "You're acting like a teenager," Candace had said, and Margaret had left her daughter's house in Evanston without touching her sweet potato pie. Marcus, her son, was a different wound entirely. He'd been estranged from the family for 15 years, ever since he'd come out as gay, and Reverend Montgomery, Margaret's father, had disowned him publicly from the pulpit. Margaret had tried to maintain a relationship with Marcus, but her efforts had been half-hearted, contaminated by shame she couldn't quite shake. Marcus lived somewhere in Atlanta now, worked in fashion or design or something creative. They exchanged Christmas cards and nothing else. Margaret sometimes wondered if her inability to fight for her son, to choose him over her father's approval, had hollowed something essential inside her. Maybe that's why she clung so desperately to Raymond now. Maybe she was trying to prove she could still be chosen, still be worth fighting for. The South Side neighborhood where Margaret had grown up had changed dramatically over the decades. Bronzeville, once the heart of Black Chicago's cultural renaissance, had gentrified in patches. Organic grocery stores now stood where corner stores had sold loose cigarettes and dream books. The young professionals moving in were black, mostly, but different. Bougie, her father would have said, with their yoga studios and craft cocktail bars. Margaret existed between worlds, too old for the new Bronzeville, too changed for the old. Raymond's club occupied that liminal space perfectly. The Blue Note revival catered to an older crowd that remembered when jazz was Chicago's heartbeat, but Raymond had recently started hosting younger artists, neo-soul singers and spoken-word poets who drew a hipper demographic. Margaret had noticed Raymond's attention shifting with his clientele, his gaze lingering on women who wore natural hair and vintage dresses, women who embodied an effortless cool Margaret could never quite achieve. 3 months ago, Raymond had casually mentioned that his ex-girlfriend, a 42-year-old gallery owner named Simone, had stopped by the club. Just being friendly, he'd said, but Margaret had seen how his phone lit up with increasing frequency, how he'd started taking calls in the other room. That's when the idea had taken root: if she looked younger, tighter, better, Raymond would stay. Love, Margaret had learned, was war, and she'd been a soldier once. The changes started subtly, the way poison works, slowly, then all at once. Raymond began canceling dates with increasing regularity. "Club business," he'd say, his voice warm with an apology over the phone. "You know how it is, baby. I'll make it up to you." But he never did. Margaret found herself driving past the Blue Note revival on nights when Raymond claimed to be too busy to see her. She'd park across the street, engine idling, watching the entrance like a detective on a stakeout. She told herself she wasn't spying, just checking. Just making sure he was really there, really working, really being the man he claimed to be. One Friday evening in early November, she'd seen Simone arrive, tall and willowy in a leather jacket and high-waisted jeans, her locks piled on her head in an effortlessly chic bun. She'd seen Raymond greet her at the door, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture both possessive and intimate. They'd disappeared inside together, and Margaret had sat in her car for 3 hours, tears streaming down her face, unable to drive away and unable to go inside. She'd started scrutinizing herself with surgical precision. Every morning, she'd stand naked before her bedroom mirror, cataloging her flaws, the loose skin on her arms, the way her breasts had settled lower on her chest, the stubborn roll of flesh around her middle that no amount of crunches could eliminate. She was fighting time itself, and time was winning. Candace noticed the obsession first. "Mama, you've lost weight," her daughter said during a rare lunch meeting in December. "Are you eating?" "I'm eating," Margaret lied. She'd been following a punishing diet, 1,200 calories a day, no carbs, no sugar, no joy. She'd lost 18 pounds in 6 weeks, and Raymond still hadn't proposed making their relationship official. Still hadn't changed his Facebook status. Still kept her at arm's length whenever his friends or business associates were around. At a holiday party at the club, Margaret had stood beside Raymond as he held court, his arm around her waist, until a prominent alderman arrived with his wife. Then Raymond's arm had dropped, and he'd introduced Margaret as a friend, his voice devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for her. That night, Margaret had gone home and researched plastic surgeons. The consultation with Dr. David Chen had been both humiliating and hopeful. He'd examined her abdomen with clinical detachment, explaining the procedure: full abdominoplasty, liposuction of the flanks, muscle tightening. "You're a good candidate," he'd said, "though at your age, there are risks we need to discuss." The risks had been recited like a grocery list: infection, blood clots, poor wound healing, fluid accumulation, anesthesia complications. Margaret had signed the consent forms without really reading them, her mind already constructing fantasies of Raymond's reaction when he saw her new body. She'd scheduled the surgery for January 15th. She'd told Candace she was having a minor procedure, and swore her to secrecy. She'd told Raymond she was visiting relatives in Detroit. She'd paid the $15,000 fee with money from her retirement account. Money she'd been saving for a trip to West Africa, a journey to trace her ancestry back to its source. But ancestry could wait. Youth could not. The morning of January 15, 2025, dawned gray and bitter, with wind chill warnings and the kind of cold that made Chicago streets glitter like shattered glass. Margaret woke at 5 a.m. in her Hyde Park brownstone, showered with the antibacterial soap the surgical center had provided, and dressed in the loose clothing they'd recommended. Her hands shook as she applied makeup, just enough to look alive, not enough to appear vain. Vanity, her father had always preached, was a sin. But wasn't all beauty vanity? Wasn't every attempt to be loved just another form of pride? The surgical center was in a medical building near Northwestern Hospital, gleaming and modern, with abstract art on the walls and classical music piped through hidden speakers. Margaret checked in at 7 a.m. Her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the preoperative area, a nurse named Tamika, a young black woman with kind eyes and tired edges, helped Margaret into the hospital gown, took her vital signs, and inserted the 4-line into her hand. "You nervous?" Tamika asked, and Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the fear lodged in her throat. Dr. Chen came by to mark her abdomen with those purple lines, his hands efficient and impersonal. The anesthesiologist, a middle-aged white man named Dr. Brennan, explained that he'd be monitoring her throughout the procedure, that she'd be completely asleep, that when she woke up, it would all be over. "Any last questions?" Dr. Chen asked. Margaret wanted to ask if she'd wake up beautiful. If she'd wake up loved. If this violation of her body would somehow make her worthy of a man who'd never quite committed to her. Instead, she shook her head. They wheeled her into the operating room at 8:30 a.m. The space was cold and bright, with stainless steel instruments laid out on blue cloths like instruments of holy ritual. Margaret stared up at the surgical lights, circular and blindingly bright, and thought of UFO abduction stories, of being taken and examined and changed against your will. "Count backward from 10, Dr. Brennan said, his voice muffled behind his surgical mask. Margaret counted, 10, 9, 8. The world went black. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Dr. Chen removed excess skin and fat, tightened her abdominal muscles, sculpted her flanks. He worked with artistic precision, creating the body Margaret believed she needed to keep Raymond's love. In the recovery room, Margaret woke to pain, deep, grinding, overwhelming pain that made her gasp and moan. Tamika was there, adjusting the morphine drip, murmuring reassurances. "You did great, Ms. Patterson." Dr. Chen said everything went perfectly. But nothing was perfect. Nothing would ever be perfect again. Margaret was discharged later that evening with prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics, instructions for wound care, and warnings about blood clots and infection. Candace, who'd taken emergency leave from the hospital, picked her up and drove her home in tense silence. "This was foolish, Mama," Candace said as she helped Margaret into bed, positioning pillows to keep her elevated, setting up the surgical drains that would collect fluid from the incisions. "Risking your life for a man who—" "Don't," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "Please don't." That night, Margaret slept fitfully, haunted by fever dreams. She dreamed of Raymond dancing with Simone, their bodies moving in perfect synchronicity. She dreamed of her father preaching about vanity and flesh and the wages of sin. She dreamed of Marcus, her lost son, standing in a doorway she couldn't reach. By morning, she was feverish. By afternoon, she couldn't catch her breath. By evening, Candace was calling 911. Margaret died at 3:47 a.m. on January 17, 2025, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, with Candace holding her hand and Raymond nowhere to be found. The official cause of death was pulmonary embolism. A blood clot had traveled from her leg to her lungs, cutting off oxygen, suffocating her from the inside. It was a known complication of abdominal surgery, listed clearly in the consent forms Margaret had signed without truly comprehending. Candace held her mother's hand as the monitors flatlined, as the nurses moved with practiced efficiency to record the time, as the attending physician murmured condolences that meant nothing. She held her mother's hand and thought about all the conversations they'd never have, all the forgiveness they'd never exchange, all the love that had curdled into obligation and resentment. She'd tried calling Raymond 14 times in the past 24 hours. He hadn't answered once. The funeral was held on January 22 at Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Reverend Montgomery, now 86 and frail but still sharp-tongued, presided over his daughter's homegoing. The sanctuary was full of Margaret's friends, former colleagues from Child Protective Services, church members who'd known her since childhood. Raymond Cole was notably absent. Marcus came. He flew in from Atlanta wearing a black suit and grief that had aged him before his time. He was 43 now, with salt and pepper hair and his mother's cheekbones. He sat in the back, not with the family, and Candace only noticed him when it was too late to bridge the distance. After the service, after they'd lowered Margaret into frozen ground at Graceland Cemetery beside Thomas Patterson, Candace went home to her mother's brownstone to begin the grim work of settling an estate. She boxed up clothes that still smelled like Margaret's perfume, Chanel No. 5, the same fragrance she'd worn for 40 years. She sorted through papers and bills and photographs. And she found the receipts. They were stuffed in Margaret's desk drawer, in a folder labeled RC. Thousands of dollars in loans, gifts, transfers. The Rolex. The club renovations. A down payment on a car. More than $50,000, drained from Margaret's retirement savings, all flowing toward Raymond Cole like blood from an open wound. Candace sat at her mother's desk, holding those receipts, and felt rage crystallize inside her chest like ice. She called Raymond. Again. Left another voicemail. Then she did what her mother had done, she drove to the Blue Note Revival. It was a Thursday night, and the club was crowded with the after-work crowd. Candace pushed through the door, past the hostess, scanning the dim interior for Raymond. She found him at the bar, laughing with a young woman in a red dress, his hand resting possessively on her thigh. Raymond. Candace's voice cut through the jazz and conversation like a blade. He turned, and for a moment, genuine fear flickered across his handsome face. Then he composed himself, stood, approached her with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Candace, I'm so sorry about Margaret." "Where were you?" Candace demanded. "My mother died calling your name, and you couldn't even answer your phone. I didn't know she was, I thought she was in Detroit, visiting family." "You knew exactly where she was." Candace thrust the receipts at him. "She told you about the surgery. She did it for you." Raymond's expression shifted. "Not guilt, but calculation. Your mother made her own choices. I never asked her for. You took $50,000 from her." The club had gone quiet. All eyes were on them now, this tableau of grief and accusation. Raymond's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Those were gifts. Your mother was generous. What we had was real. Was it real 2 days ago, when you were photographed with another woman outside the Peninsula Hotel?" The color drained from Raymond's face. Candace pulled out her phone, showed him the photo that a friend had sent her that afternoon, Raymond with his arm around Simone, both of them laughing, looking like lovers without a care in the world. The photo was time-stamped January 19th, 2 days after Margaret died. "Get out of my club," Raymond said quietly. "Your club?" Candace laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "My mother helped pay for this club. Her money is in these walls, in that sound system, in those lights. This club was built on her hope, and you let her die alone." Candace didn't sleep that night. She sat in her mother's living room, surrounded by boxes and memories, and thought about control. How little we have, how desperately we cling to the illusion of it. Her mother had believed she could control Raymond's love by controlling her appearance. Raymond had believed he could control women by controlling his image. And Candace herself had believed she could control everything through achievement and discipline and perfection. But control, like love, was mostly an illusion. By morning, Candace had made a decision. She would not cry anymore. She would not rage. She would become something harder, colder, more dangerous. She would become the instrument of justice her mother deserved. She called her lawyer, a sharp-eyed black woman named Tasha Freeman who specialized in fraud and elder exploitation. She laid out the financial records, the receipts, the timeline of Raymond's manipulation. Tasha listened, made notes, and finally said, "We can make a case for financial exploitation and undue influence. Won't bring your mother back, but we can make his life very uncomfortable." Candace also called a journalist friend at the Chicago Tribune, a woman who'd been looking for a story about cosmetic surgery risks and the vulnerability of older women. "Would your mother want this public?" the journalist asked. "My mother wanted to be loved," Candace replied. "She got that wrong. Maybe this will help someone else get it right." But the real transformation was internal. Candace had spent her entire life trying to be good daughter, good student, good doctor. Goodness, she believed, was armor. But goodness had not protected her mother. Goodness had not stopped Marcus from being cast out. Goodness was just another word for compliance. She remembered the Stoic philosophers she'd studied in college, Marcus Aurelius writing in Meditations about accepting what we cannot control and changing what we can. About duty and justice as the highest virtues. About how the obstacle becomes the way. Her mother's death was the obstacle. Justice would be the way. Candace began documenting everything, Margaret's texts to Raymond, professing love and receiving minimal responses. The financial records show a pattern of manipulation. Interviews with other women who'd been involved with Raymond, there were 3, all older, all financially generous, all eventually discarded. She transformed her grief into ammunition. The lawsuit took 3 months to prepare. Tasha Freeman built a case accusing Raymond Cole of undue influence, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and wrongful death, arguing that his manipulation had directly led Margaret to pursue dangerous surgery. It was a stretch, legally. But it was morally righteous, and sometimes righteousness mattered more than law. Raymond hired expensive lawyers who argued that Margaret was a grown woman capable of making her own decisions, that the gifts were freely given, that correlation was not causation. They painted Margaret as unstable, obsessed, delusional, a woman who'd created a fantasy relationship in her own mind. Candace sat through depositions where Raymond's lawyers dissected her mother's mental state, her financial decisions, her text messages. They read aloud Margaret's desperate declarations of love, her anxious messages asking why Raymond wasn't responding, her increasingly frantic attempts to hold his attention. It was like watching her mother die again, more slowly, more publicly. The Chicago Tribune story ran on April 3, The Cost of Love, When Cosmetic Surgery Becomes Fatal. It featured Margaret's story alongside interviews with plastic surgeons about the risks older patients faced, and profiles of other women who'd undergone dangerous procedures to please romantic partners. The story went viral. Suddenly, Margaret's private humiliation became a public cautionary tale. Raymond's club started to struggle. The older clientele who'd been loyal for years began staying away, uncomfortable with the controversy. The younger crowd didn't know the full story and didn't care, they found new venues, hipper places without the taint of death and exploitation. But the legal case was falling apart. Margaret's texts and financial records showed a woman who was willing, even eager, to give Raymond whatever he wanted. Undue influence required proving Raymond had explicitly manipulated her, and his lawyers argued he'd simply accepted her generosity. The wrongful death claim was even weaker. Dar. Chen had followed all protocols. Margaret had been warned of the risks. Her death, while tragic, was a known complication, not medical malpractice. Tasha called Candace in late May with the news, they're offering a settlement. $50,000, the amount Margaret gave him. He'll return the money, we'll drop the suit, everyone walks away. That's not justice, Candace said. No, Tasha agreed. But it's resolution. Candace thought about her mother, about control and acceptance, about the difference between justice and revenge. Marcus Aurelius had written, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. She told Tasha she'd think about it. Then she went to the Blue Note revival one last time. It was a Tuesday night in June, and the club was nearly empty. A lone saxophonist played melancholy standards to a scattered audience of regulars too loyal or too lonely to find somewhere else. Raymond was behind the bar, pouring whiskey into a glass with the slow deliberation of a man who'd been drinking all day. He looked up when Candace entered, and something like resignation crossed his face. "Come to twist the knife some more?" he asked. Candace sat at the bar, ignoring the tremor of rage in her hands. "I came to understand." "Understand what? Why did you let her die?" Raymond laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I didn't let her die. I didn't even know she was. You knew." Candace's voice was steady now, surgical. "She told you about the surgery. I found the texts. You knew, and you said it was a good idea. You knew, and you were with another woman 2 days after she died." Raymond drank his whiskey, refilled the glass. "Your mother was a beautiful woman. Gracious. Kind. But she was also—" "What?" "Desperate. The word hung between them like smoke. She wanted something from me I couldn't give her. Youth. Purpose. Salvation. I'm just a man, Candace. I'm not a church. You took her money. You took everything she had. She gave it. Raymond's eyes were bloodshot, haunted. You think I'm proud of that? You think I wanted to be the kind of man who, he stopped, swallowed. I grew up poor. Southside Memphis, projects, no father, mother on drugs. I clawed my way to this. He gestured at the club, the peeling paint, the water-stained ceiling, the dream dying slowly. And yeah, when a woman offers to help, I take it. Because I learned young that you take what's offered, because tomorrow it might be gone. So my mother was just, what? A transaction? No. Raymond's voice cracked. I cared about her. I did. But I couldn't love her the way she needed to. The way she deserved. And I was too much of a coward to tell her that, so I just let her keep hoping. Candace thought about her mother standing before mirrors, cataloging her flaws, believing transformation was possible. She thought about herself, 38 and still chasing her father's approval, still trying to be perfect enough to matter. She died believing you loved her, Candace said quietly. Maybe that's better than dying knowing I didn't. No, Candace said. Illusion is never better than truth. She stood, pulled out the settlement papers Tasha had prepared, and placed them on the bar. Sign these. Return the money. And stay away from women like my mother, women who confuse attention with love. Raymond stared at the papers. And if I don't? Then I make sure every woman in Chicago knows exactly what you are. I will make sure your club, this dream you sold your soul for, becomes a monument to your cowardice. Raymond picked up a pen with shaking hands. As he signed, Candace felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and a grief so profound it had calcified into something harder. For what it's worth, Raymond said, not looking at her, I'm sorry. Sorry, don't resurrect the dead, Candace replied. She left him there, alone in his dying club, and walked out into the June evening where the city hummed with life and possibility and all the illusions we constructed to survive. The settlement money went to establish the Margaret Louise Patterson Memorial Scholarship at Chicago State University, full tuition for first-generation college students studying social work. Candace announced it at a press conference in July, standing beside Marcus, who'd flown back to Chicago for the occasion. Our mother believed in transformation, Candace told the reporters. She believed people could change, could be saved, could become better versions of themselves. She dedicated her life to helping others transform. This scholarship honors that belief, the right way. Raymond Cole sold The Blue Note Revival in August and left Chicago. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody particularly cared. Dr. David Chen faced no legal consequences. The surgery had been performed according to standard protocols, and pulmonary embolism was a known risk. But he started spending more time in consultations, started pressing harder on the psychological evaluations, started saying no more often to patients who seemed to be pursuing surgery for the wrong reasons. Candace took a leave of absence from Northwestern and spent the summer cleaning out her mother's brownstone. She found journals Margaret had kept, decades of entries about hope and disappointment, love and loneliness, the small surrenders women make to survive in a world that worships youth. One entry, dated 3 weeks before the surgery, read, I am afraid of dying. But I am more afraid of dying without having been truly seen. Raymond sees me. Or maybe I just want to believe he does. Maybe that's the same thing. Candace wept reading those words. Wept for her mother, for herself, for all the women who confused visibility with value. She reached out to Marcus, and they began the slow, painful work of reconciliation. He told her about his life in Atlanta, his partner of 8 years, the design firm they'd built together. He told her about the years of silence, the rejection that had nearly destroyed him. "Mama tried," Marcus said one evening as they sorted through photograph albums. "She wasn't strong enough to choose me over Grandpa, over the church, over respectability. But she tried." "Is trying enough?" Candace asked. "It has to be," Marcus said. "Because it's all we have." On the first anniversary of Margaret's death, Candace stood at her grave in Graceland Cemetery, snow falling softly on the granite headstone. The inscription read, Margaret Louise Patterson, 1959 to 2025. Beloved mother, social worker, advocate. She believed in transformation, Candace had learned, over the past year, that transformation was possible, just not the kind her mother had pursued. You couldn't transform yourself into someone else's ideal. You couldn't surgically remove the fundamental loneliness of being human. You couldn't purchase worthiness with your body as currency. But you could transform your grief into purpose. Your anger into justice. Your loss into legacy. She thought about the Stoic philosophers and their teachings on acceptance. Not passive resignation, but active engagement with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Her mother had spent her final years fighting reality, trying to become younger, trying to keep a man who'd never been fully present. The deeper truth was harder. Margaret had never fully accepted herself. She'd spent 65 years seeking validation from others, her father, her husband, her lovers, instead of cultivating it within. And that void, that fundamental lack of self-worth, had ultimately killed her as surely as the blood clot. Candace placed roses on the grave, white ones, her mother's favorite. "I see you, Mama," she whispered. "I finally see you. The real you, not the woman you pretended to be." The wind carried her words across the cemetery, past hundreds of graves holding hundreds of stories, each one a testament to love and loss and the fundamental human hunger to matter. Marcus appeared beside her, placing his own flowers, sunflowers, bright and defiant against the snow. They stood together in silence, two survivors of a family that had demanded perfection and offered judgment, learning belatedly to be gentle with the dead. "Do you think she found peace?" Marcus asked. Candace considered this. "I think she found what she was looking for, just not in the way she expected." "What was she looking for?" "To be enough," Candace said. "Just as she was." They left the cemetery together as dusk fell over Chicago, the city lights beginning to glow against the winter darkness, each one a small act of defiance against the night. Margaret Patterson's story isn't unique, it's a tragedy that repeats itself across generations, genders, and cultures. The desperate attempt to transform ourselves into someone worthy of love. The belief that if we just change enough, sacrifice enough, diminish ourselves enough, we'll finally be chosen. But here's the question that haunts us: would you have done it differently? If you'd loved someone who made you feel alive again after years of numbness, wouldn't you have made sacrifices? Wouldn't you have tried to become the version of yourself you thought they wanted? Or is the deeper question this: why do we believe love requires transformation? Why can't we be enough, exactly as we are, in this exact moment? If Margaret were here now, what would you tell her? Would you say her death was her own fault, the consequence of vanity and poor judgment? Or would you say she was a victim of a culture that tells women their value decreases with every passing year, that youth is currency, that desirability is worthiness? Maybe the truth lives somewhere between those extremes. Maybe we're all both victims and accomplices in our own destruction. So I'll ask you directly, have you ever changed yourself, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to keep someone's love? Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen nothing but flaws? Have you ever believed you weren't enough? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about the price we pay for love, and whether that price is ever worth it, And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've lost, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. Because Margaret's story deserves to be told, and her death deserves to mean something, asterisk asterisk. Remember, you are enough. Right now. Exactly.